Now, when we look at the African American experience, and obviously at this point, uh, to remind you, I am a white person of privilege, and part of my privilege and part of my uh, family legacy comes from the exploitation of African Americans. So the legacy of oppression here is not only the fact that the oppression of Black people and the oppression of enslaved peoples made possible the fortunes of many white families, particularly those that go back a ways, into the colonial period, or even back into the 19th century. So the legacy of oppression has two components to it. It's the privilege that white people get as a result of it, and it's also the oppression that African Americans experience throughout that history. So African American identity obviously is extremely complicated because when we look at African American identity specifically, we're looking at people who, for the most part, were brought here involuntarily. They're one of America's only involuntary immigrant groups, and they were for most of the pre-national experience, meaning colonial experience, most of them were either enslaved people in extremely restricted conditions, or were free Blacks who also were discriminated against and had to deal with that. So the story isn't just about their oppression. The story is also, as the picture of Barack Obama suggests, although he is really technically not African American, he was a biracial man with an African father. So it's tricky. What do we mean by African American? Usually the term suggests people who have been here longer, and most African Americans have been here a good deal longer than white people have. Most African American people can trace their family roots back to the 17th and 18th centuries, well before many white Americans ever got here. So their history is deeper, longer, and in many ways more conflicted because of the history. Now, when we look at, I'm not going to ask you to write on this, and I'm not going to ask you to take 5 minutes, but this idea of African Americans being a problem, it's a problem for white people because again, if you're looking at this sort of the idea of the American dream and upward mobility, and this idea of assimilation, Malcolm X obviously did not view this at all that way. He viewed it as, look, if we're stuck in this white supremacy paradigm, then we have to define ourselves separately. We can't. We have to look at our own values, our own history, and we have to be careful about things like Christianity, which is the white man's religion, and we have to be careful about capitalism, which is the white man's system. And so again, if we're a capitalist country, African Americans represent a problem there because the success of, as I was suggesting earlier, of many white businesses was dependent on the exploitation of Black people. So we tend to leave that out of the narrative because it's embarrassing, or in some cases just morally reprehensible. So this idea, will we ever get to a point of a post-racial society? I would love to hear your thoughts on that. I don't think we're anywhere close to it at this point. In fact, we're probably further away than we were at the end of Obama's presidency, perhaps just because the white backlash has become more present and more obvious in the overall narrative. So Du Bois says, he's speaking to the white community, your country, how came it to be yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here. True. Here we have brought our three gifts and mingled them with yours, a gift of story and song. It's interesting that he focuses on those two together, right? The gift of narrative and the gift of singing. So if you want to think about that for a second, those are very important cultural gifts that African Americans bring. But we also brought, he says, right, the sweat and brawn to beat back the wilderness. In other words, African Americans made this country. They built this country. They built its economy. They built its signature buildings, the Capitol Rotunda. They built the Capitol. They built the White House. And therefore, if you really think about who deserves credit for that, it's not the people perhaps in the house, it's the people who built the house. And this is Randall Robinson's point in the beginning of the reading. If you did the one that he wrote, he talks about going into the rotunda and looking up. This is where all of the people that invaded the Capitol on January 6th, if you notice, they kind of got spellbound. They were looking at all the pictures of the landing of Columbus and the embarkation of the Pilgrims, all those old white stories of triumph. It's interesting if you look at that from a Black perspective. The Black narrative isn't there; it's left out. So his point is, look, if you're thinking about this as a training, you're training white people to see their social expectations realized in art. You're training them to see people in positions of power and authority. Those are the people they're looking up to, and therefore they're way more likely to achieve those things. Whereas it talks about the locking down in a permanent class, how the natively talented but low expectation Blacks. So again, you have a lot of people that have talent, but if you subject them to low expectations and you don't give them anything to look to as far as models of success, they're way more likely to be successful. And again, this idea of perennial privilege, perennial white privilege is obvious. It may not be obvious from a white perspective, because if you live in it, it's just the water you swim in. But if you look at it from a Black perspective, it's self-evident. It's part of the history, the lived history of African Americans in the present day, and it has been the lived history of this African American experience. So this idea of the majority culture that has wronged us dramatically, this is Randall Robinson again, emptied our memories, undermined our self-esteem. That's through plantation slavery, that's through sharecropping, that's through segregation, implanted us with palatable voices, right? You've given us the voice of the white man. If you're a Black person listening to my voice, yet again, you're listening to the voice of authority and the voice of history, which is always a white voice. So this idea of how do we find ourselves in this stolen history? Now, what's interesting is if you go back to the beginning of American history, particularly in the South, if you go to Virginia, this is a fascinating picture. It's not a great picture, but if you look at the English prisoners getting ready to go to America, you'll see that there are white people in a coffle. A coffle is basically a group of people tied up in chains. And this wasn't a rare sight. If you were to go to Virginia in the 17th century, you would have seen white people in chains, just as you would have seen Black people in chains. And yes, they would have been put in separate lines, but servitude was basically the way of the world in Virginia. There was white servitude and there was Black servitude. White planters bought wives literally in the same way that they would buy property in any other way. And so what's interesting about this is that Black slavery, right, the equation of racism and slavery, didn't really exist at the beginning. Slavery was biracial, particularly indentured servitude was biracial. Now, this comes to a head in 1676, but I think it's interesting because if you look at all of these indentured servants, which they usually had a period of service that was about 10 years. So they would come to the United States. Let's imagine you got here in 1630. And by 1640, you would be free. And so what happened is if you look at the map there, that's the Chesapeake Bay area. But if you look sort of closest to where the water is, that's where all the big plantations were. So once you were free, you headed out to the frontier. You went west. And as you went west, you would have found a lot of people, white and Black, and different types of groups of people from different parts of Africa, different parts of Europe, beginning to set up farms and live their lives in this weird kind of multiracial paradise. It's almost an un-American story. I mean, it doesn't seem to fit in the narrative. You have biracial marriages in some cases. So people, whites and Blacks, are marrying each other. It doesn't seem to be a problem. because the idea of race doesn't exist yet as a concept of superiority and inferiority. It's there a little bit, but it's not there nearly as much as it's going to be after this particular moment. So Nathaniel Bacon was a Virginian nobleman who lived out in the western part of the colony. And the Burgesses, or the sort of the plantation owners and the rich Virginians, all lived in the east. Now, of course, the further west you went, the more likely you were to run into Native Americans. So both the blacks and the white settlers out on the frontier, they wanted help with the Native Americans, and they were out there trying to seize their land in order to seize Native American land to get their place in society. And of course, they couldn't differentiate between the Native American tribes because there were 3 different ones out in Western Virginia. And so when one Native American group or tribe would attack them, like the Doig Indians at one point attacked them, and then they go after the Oswegatchie tribe. And so you have these misunderstandings between the black and white settlers and the Native American settlers. And not Native American settlers, the Native American people whose land it was. So what you have is you have all of this black-white farming coalition that essentially wants the Virginian government to help them remove the Native Americans, and the Virginian planters don't want to have anything to do with this. They're not interested in that, and so Nathaniel Bacon basically leads a huge army of black and white people, an interracial opposition to basically oppose the Burgesses and say, look, you've got to help us out here. You're not protecting the colony. And all of a sudden, the white leadership of Virginia is faced with the fact that, oh my God, there are a lot of people out there who are relatively poor, who have issues against us. And this rebellion, it burned down one of the buildings in Jamestown. And the rebellion isn't successful at ousting these people, but essentially they get together afterwards and say, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to divide these people? And shortly after that, the slave codes are put into effect, and you begin to have laws that associate slavery with race. And then you start getting the construction of race come in on top of it. And that is the beginning of a turn towards racialized slavery, towards laws about banning intermarriage. As soon as you have the giving of land goes to white people, and the taking away of freedom gets directed at black people. So as soon as you define race, you also define land distribution. And as soon as you do that, obviously the poor white people are going to realize, oh, wait a second. If I side with the government, not only do I get to be seen as white, I also get property. And in addition to that, eventually, I will be recruited into this police force to keep these black people enslaved, which will give me more money, more opportunity. And what's interesting is this is moving ahead a little bit in history, but this is in the 19th century. You begin to see poor white people being enlisted into this racist system to keep black people down. So again, the long history of black concern about policing, at least the South, was well justified, because basically it was racialized violence against them to keep them enslaved. And I think that's interesting. So it's important to understand that racism was not an American invention, but it was used in America along with white supremacy to create the racialized system of slavery and to change the narrative. So what I'm going to look at the next video is what happens next. But clearly, slavery is going to have horrific implications. It's a totalitarian system which destroys black families, takes away their ability to have any kind of land ownership. And if you look at the amount of time there, that's 250 years effectively of slavery And that's going to have profound impacts on both the white and black societies, giving whites land, money, opportunity, and taking all those things away from black people. So it's not just race, it's also economics.